Good afternoon. My name is Spencer Griffith. I'm an international trade partner at the law firm of Akin Gump here in Washington, D.C. I'm also vice chairman of the International Law Institute. We'd like to welcome you to today's webinar discussion of the current state of the world trading system. This is one presentation in ILI's COVID-19 series, which presents webinars on a variety of topics relating to the impact of and dealing with the virus crisis. You could visit the ILI website to see a list of these webinars. ILI is based here in Washington and is a nonprofit educational institution that provides training and technical assistance to government officials, legal and business professionals, and scholars from all around the world. We encourage you to visit the ILI website to learn more about the ILI. I would now like to introduce my co-host, Patrick Macrory. Patrick has worked as a lawyer, he's lectured and written about a wide variety of trade issues for decades. Patrick is also head of the ILI's Trade Center and handles and coordinates all trade issues and presentations for ILI. Patrick?
Thank you, Spencer. A lot of topics to cover. We're going to try to keep this to 1 hour or maybe a little bit longer. Obviously, trade is very active. We could spend hours and hours and days talking about these issues, but we're going to try to do it quickly. We're going to try to start with COVID, which obviously is the #1 issue in trade at the moment. We'll talk then about regional trade agreements and their impact on the WTO, how that's changing the world. Then we'll talk about the problems of the WTO itself, as probably most people listening to this or watching this realize that the WTO is having a lot of difficulty at the moment, particularly with the dispute settlement system. And then finally, we want to talk about China's role in the world trade system. We've got two renowned and very experienced experts to talk about this. Gary Horlick started at the Senate Finance Committee doing trade. He was then in charge of anti-dumping and countervailing duty at the Commerce Department, and he's now recognized as one of the very top trade lawyers in the world. Wendy Cutler has spent many years at USTR, ending up as acting deputy USTR, and a lot of work on trade agreements. She was in charge of the TPP, the late lamented TPP, and was the chief negotiator for Korea, so she has huge experience on RTAs. So I'd like to start with COVID and turn to Gary. It seems to me, they're both short-term and long-term effects. Short-term, obviously huge. The WTO a week or two ago came out with an estimate that the trade this year would drop by between 13 and 32%, quite a wide range depending on the assumptions you make, but obviously enormous. And then what are the long term? How will trade change as a result of COVID in the long term? Gary.
Thanks very much, Patrick. Let me start with the most obvious, most discussed, what I would call first order trade policy issues, which is the export restrictions in the US and elsewhere against exporting relevant medical equipment. And this is not a question of protectionism, isolationism, decoupling, or anything else. This is numbers. But it illustrates what in essence was Adam Smith's point. National borders are not relevant. What relevant is transport technology. So Smith said if you have two villages they're too far away to trade with each other, then they don't have trade. It's in the same county. Well, once you had railroads and scheduled steamships and now, planes and internet and all that, it's one big market to a large extent. What does that mean for COVID and pandemics? No one in there, so let's say the US alone, the estimates of how many N95 masks you would need in a year, I've seen 3 billion, 5 billion, 10 billion, it's in the billions. No country or world would stockpile 10 billion masks. For one thing, they run out of time, they expire. So you would never stockpile enough stuff for the whole world, which would be 100 billion masks, because you don't know when the next one's coming or what its nature would be. So that's why you do two things. Each country would prepare, underline prepare, because we didn't. So the proposal in the US was to build some machines this was completed in 2018, the plans for a prototype to produce lots and lots of them really fast. So you want everyone doing that, not just one country. So you want to coordinate. That's where I get to the international side. You want to coordinate to make sure everyone has these machines in place. So you don't stockpile 10 billion masks each, you stockpile 100 machines each. And then you don't block trade, because someone's going to have more masks than they need, someone's going to have more shields than they need, etc. So this is just standard numbers. In a worldwide pandemic, you can't hoard, because you have to be able to hoard everything that you would need, and no country can afford to do that. So you do it globally and coordinate. This is times 10 for food, and some countries have been blocking exports of food. This was done in 2008, 2009, was viewed as basically a mistake. Some countries are going down that road. The G20, including the US at the last minute, signed on to, we're not going to block exports of food. But that's because we don't have any shortages yet. But anyhow, so the most immediate one, which is export controls, and I might add, you can argue that both of those are legal under Article 11 of GATT. There's an exception for emergencies, but it's a bad idea. Just numbers. There's no ideology here. You can't possibly stockpile enough for a nationwide pandemic in the US. Probably the biggest problems we've had, geographically, would be Mississippi River flooding, including New Orleans. We've never had something that hit the whole country. So now we have. All right, so that's the most obvious. Longer term, medium term, I hope it's short term, the world trading system, the world trade is going to plummet, as the WTO predicted, because the economies are going down. This has nothing to do with trade. This is not like 1930 with Smoot-Hawley tariff, where we raise it and everyone else, MFN, raises their tariffs. This is demand's going down all over the world. Oil's the obvious, canary in the tunnel, but so the main thing is to not, everyone agree, get the G20 and everyone else, like they did in 2008 in November, to it was April 2009, like they did, to make sure that they all get together and don't do stupid things. So that's the medium term. Long term, I don't know. I'm not optimistic, but positive thinking suggests in the past people have come up with vaccines for things like Ebola, which is a virus. So it's not impossible to think of a virus, a vaccine in medium term, of remedies in medium term, or palliatives. Once that happens, there's a large rebound effect. To take the obvious American example, after 2 months of zero sales of toilet paper, as everyone uses their stocks, so there's going to be a huge boom in buying not just toilet paper, cars. There's going to be a huge boom in buying cars because no one's out buying cars. They're down like 90%. Household equipment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if this is stopped medium term, I think the world economy recovers fairly quickly, and that will be visible even before it happens. So that will dominate the trade picture. If that doesn't happen, if this drags on 4 or 5 years, yeah, it's going to be huge pressure on the trading system. I'll talk a little later about the WTO side of this, but I think for the moment at least, the action is regional agreements, and I defer to Wendy, but I think regional agreements are places, and depends on what China does, what CPTPP does, but those two in particular, but also others she can discuss, what they do will matter, and she'll tell us what they're going to do or what they're doing.
Wendy, do you want to say anything? Do you have anything on COVID that you want to add before we move on?
Yes, so with respect to COVID, I think Gary's done a good job in underscoring the proliferation of export restrictions of medical equipment and medical supplies and even food that we're seeing around the globe. And I think the latest count suggests there are over 70 countries that have put export restrictions in place, including the United States, including the European Union and certain member states, and including China. In addition, though, on the positive side, we're also seeing many countries have, at least for the time being, have suspended their tariffs to allow them tariff-free importation of a lot of these materials and supplies, knowing that they need to get access to these supplies quickly. And so on the trade front, that's a positive development. Finally, we're seeing a great impact on supply chains, with many companies feeling very vulnerable and discovering vulnerabilities in their supply chains that they didn't even know existed. And a lot of this has to do with the amount of inputs they're getting from all around the world, including China, but also as a result of kind of the logistics challenges that they're facing, as travel has been banned in many countries, as borders have been shut, and as frankly, workers have been too sick to go to work and to unload ships and planes. So I would just add those concerns on to Gary's list. Moreover, and Gary alluded to this, but I would just like to emphasize it, I think the response from international economic organizations, including the G20, the G7, and the WTO, has been pretty weak in this crisis. They are issuing statements, they kind of have the right buzzwords in these statements, but when you actually try and find the actions that they've agreed to take to deal with these issues, they're pretty minimal. And I think that really distinguishes this current pandemic crisis with what happened during the global financial crisis when the G20 really stepped up to the plate. However, and this is my last point, what we are seeing is many medium-sized countries trying to fill the vacuum of the absence of US leadership in the world at this time by collectively coming up with statements and initiatives to urge countries to suspend their tariffs, to lift their export restrictions, to keep their supply chains open and to keep their trade lanes open. In particular, New Zealand and Singapore have been very active on this front, but just last week, Canada led an initiative with 23 WTO members to urge WTO members not to impose export restrictions on food now. So I think it's very useful to watch, can these medium-sized countries really try and fill the vacuum of leadership with the big countries kind of missing in action.
Just a quick point on value chains, which I think they now represent about half of world trade is in the form of intermediate products. I would imagine that companies that use value chains will try to diversify, maybe more sources than one. Just in time may become time enough. I would think that would become quite significant. I don't know whether either of you think.
I'm not sure of that. We'll see. That long term, that if this goes on a long time, yes, maybe. Although a lot of the problems in the supply chains are ports getting stacked up because of people not working at the port, et cetera, et cetera. But once that gets sorted out, there's a reason the supply chains are what they are. And I repeat, this is nothing to do with international trade. It's just as true for national trade, where we're discovering within the US all kinds of little things we didn't think about, like childcare not being available. Well, you're not going to go back to work if you have preschool kids. Oops, the schools are closed, et cetera, et cetera. No one thought this stuff through, and it's not just international. There's a reason for the supply chains, and if, just to pick at random, Samsung decides to completely focus production in the US and Apple doesn't, and Apple has lower prices as a result or higher profits, Samsung has to follow that lead. That's totally hypothetical. I don't represent either. So I think there'll be less impact on supply chains unless governments mandate it. There may be some diversification, but there was already diversification, as Wendy knows, to Vietnam for other reasons. That was the whole point of TPP when we were in it.
Right.
I think what will happen is, again, this is if it's short term, companies will recalibrate, but I repeat, nothing you can do about the supply chain will lead you to have in your corporate headquarters a backlog, an inventory of 10 billion masks.
Right.
And so just in time, the system we're in values higher profits today over altruistic over inventory. And so it's up to governments to assure that inventory, and they can't have 10 billion masks either, but they can have 10 machines, and they didn't build them.
I differ a bit. I do think we're going to see some important adjustments made to supply chains. I don't think we're going to see all US companies leaving China and coming back to the United States. That's not going to happen. But I think we are going to see companies putting a bigger premium on risk mitigation and maybe balancing their need to reduce costs and promote efficiencies with reducing vulnerabilities. So we were already seeing certain companies diversify supply chains as a result of the US-China trade war. And I think COVID is going to kind of accelerate some of those trends with companies when they can, and when, for example, when they're expanding or thinking of new operations, to diversify the location of these operations. And not just to Southeast Asia, everyone talks about Vietnam, but I think Mexico is going to be a big beneficiary of this diversification, particularly with the entry into force of USMCA on July 1. I couldn't agree with Gary more that with respect to medical equipment, medical supplies, and medicines, we are going to see governments getting more into the action and pursuing policies that would incentivize domestic production and perhaps even give benefits to companies that come back to the U.S. or back to our neighborhood. So we'll have to see how this plays out, but I do think that companies are going to be looking at supply chains very differently as a result of developments over the past few years, particularly COVID.
Just one brief observation. Companies are not in China now, at least, because of low wages. Wages are way lower in Pakistan and Bangladesh and Haiti and all over. And Wendy knows more about this than I do. China has better logistics. If you buy something from China, it has to arrive in the port of Long Beach at a 1 hour slot because of the Southern California Air Quality Board prohibits the trucks from idling. And when you buy it from China, it will arrive without the seal broken on the container, which would put you on customs blacklist, and it will arrive in your 1 hour slot so you're not out of compliance with your contract. And no other country, and as I agree with you, Mexico can do that. The threats to, we've had 2 years of yo-yoing about NAFTA, but with USMCA going into effect, that doesn't remove the threat, I might add, as long as the current president's in office. So you weigh your threats, but companies are used to weighing threats, but Chinese logistics are really good. So are Korean.
Move on.
Okay, well, let's switch gears a little bit here. Both Wendy and Gary have mentioned the importance of regional trade agreements in the trading system, and in recent years, we've seen basically an explosion of RTAs. And Wendy, this question's for you. I'll get in a moment into more specific questions about the impact of the virus. But Wendy, what are your thoughts on the current state of RTAs and their role in the trading system?
Well, I think that regional trade agreements and bilateral trade agreements have become more and more important in recent years, particularly in light of the WTO being able to negotiate new agreements. So countries that want more access than the WTO provides, or want more high standard rules and want to diversify their trading partners, are looking for other partners who share similar objectives. And as a result, you know, we've been seeing many different agreements with different configuration of countries coming together and concluding agreements. Now, under the Trump administration, the decision was made that working regionally with other countries and trade agreements was not the best approach. And the Trump administration has favored bilateral agreements over regional agreements as the way to get the best outcome. And that hasn't stopped other countries in the world from pursuing regional trade agreements. And so when the US, for example, left TPP, the other 11 countries didn't then just throw up their hands and go home. They decided, and it took them a few months to come to this conclusion, that given all the work they've done and given all the benefits that they thought they could accrue from this deal, they worked together under the leadership of Japan to conclude the CPTPP, which came into effect now about a year and a half ago. The other big regional trade negotiation in Asia that's going on is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership negotiations, the RCEP negotiations. They've been underway for a very long time. They were initiated in 2012. The RCEP countries are looking to conclude and sign the deal by the end of this year. I think they were on track to do so, perhaps without India, meaning there'd be 15 countries, but not India. And it remains to be seen, particularly in light of COVID, whether they can meet that deadline. But my understanding is that they are still working hard with that objective in mind.
Gary, anything to add?
First of all, I agree with everything Wendy says. She did a great job on Korea and TTIP, and congratulations. Two notes, one for lawyers out there. So no RTA that I'm aware of, certainly no major one, has a working dispute resolution system. They don't work. They have them, they just don't work for a variety of reasons. And so the US-Korea deal looks like it has one, and it was sort of copied into TPP and then copied into USMCA over the Trump administration's dead body. The House Ways and Means Committee had a hearing almost a year ago now. One of my clients was a witness, so I was there. So everyone from left, Democrats on the left, all the way through some fairly right-wing Republicans, they would call themselves that. And when USTR had put out the rumor that they didn't need binding dispute resolution because they would rely on Section 301, all of them, it was fascinating sitting there watching all of them basically say in unison, hell no, they'll retaliate. So the trade wars we've been through have somewhat educated people that there will be retaliation and it will hit every congressional district. And so that's why the lack of ideology was reflected in that. So if you take CPTPP, if we ever joined, so far the agreements the Trump administration has made with China and Japan are very small and not much in the way of dispute settlement. But if we rejoin CPTPP, or even if we don't, so let's say you have CPTPP, others will join in Korea, I think. I would defer to Wendy, Korea, Colombia, Costa Rica, Thailand when it's ready, UK. So CPTPP, if you go through it, less than half repeats WTO. Early FTAs basically were mostly WTO, so you could take your disputes to the WTO, and that in fact is what happened among the NAFTA countries. When NAFTA dispute resolution broke down in 2000, they took their disputes to the WTO. Sometimes awkward, but it worked. You can't go to the WTO for most of CPTPP. So there will have to be a working dispute settlement mechanism in TPP. I think it will, CPTPP. And that's going to become an important forum, not only for resolving CPTPP, but as precedents or reasons or prior opinions, because half of the new NAFTA is from TPP. So panels in that, I've chaired a number of panels in WTO and elsewhere, look at what other panels have done in other agreements. So from the legal side, I think it's important that whatever happens with CPTPP, its dispute settlement mechanism is very important. Second point, I'll be brief. If we do an agreement with the UK, which had been, and I can't talk much about it because of client things, the UK would be the largest economy with which the US has an FTA. And that's a startling thought. Meanwhile,
Didn't know that.
Well, we don't have one with the EU, which is the largest economy. We don't have one with China, which is second. We don't have one, which is third. We don't have one with us because we're us, which is second. We don't have one with Japan, which is fourth. Meanwhile, the EU has a deal with Japan in effect already. They've announced political agreement at the political level, and they're going over the draft now with Mercosur. God knows if that'll happen, but if they do a deal with Mercosur, meaning Brazil, that's another game changer. And RCEP, as Wendy points out, if that goes forward with or without India, even though it's not a very complete free trade agreement, that's another game changer. Bottom line, the US, no disrespect to Wendy's colleagues at USTR, we used to be in a position for decades where we chose with whom we did an FTA and when. And so if we couldn't do one with Brazil or with South Africa or with Thailand, we'd do one with Bahrain. Well, that's how we got in the position we're in, where we don't have the right array of FTAs. So any intelligent administration going forward will have to remedy that, not because we want to. This is now game theory. We have to respond to what the EU's doing, Japan's doing. If China does RCEP, what China does. So I think a lot of the action will be as Wendy said, and I hope she's right that they finish.
Interesting. Wendy, anything to add before we move to more specifics on the impact of the virus?
Yeah, I would just add that it'll be interesting to watch. I think as a result of COVID, there are certain dynamics that are going to play into these regional trade agreements, specifically whether additional countries would join CPTPP under their accession provisions, and whether the RCEP would be concluded by the end of the year. On one hand, as I mentioned earlier, I think there is a push by countries besides the United States to diversify their trading partners and to build up regional supply chains with others. So that would argue for CPTPP to expand membership as well as for RCEP to conclude. But on the other hand, as we enter into a global recession that might be quite deep and quite longer than anything we've experienced, that leads to unemployment, it leads to domestic problems and domestic economic concerns and generally more protectionism. And so, many countries who may be interested in these agreements previously may have second thoughts. And second, I would say COVID has revealed to certain countries their over-reliance on imports from certain countries, including China. So specifically when it comes to RCEP, some countries may have second thoughts about whether they really want to, get rid of their tariffs for Chinese imports. So I don't know how these competing forces are going to play out, and I could argue it both ways now, but I think these are just developments we need to watch closely over the coming months.
If I could just add one minor mechanical point, and Wendy's been in literally hundreds of these negotiations sessions. and I've been counsel to a number of those governments. I can't imagine doing this virtually.
Right.
Just, you're, go ahead, Wendy.
I think that's an excellent
Virtually.
point. I think you can exchange information virtually. Maybe you can start a negotiation and walk through your proposal, but it's very hard to conclude a deal when those tough issues need to be resolved, and trying to do that, virtually.
And corridor meetings would be difficult, wouldn't they?
Yes.
Let me just ask one big picture RTA question before we move on. I mean, the sort of views on RTAs. Number one, they're good because they allow countries to liberalize trade, not multilaterally, but particularly when the multilateral system isn't working. That's the good side. On the other hand, they create regional trading blocks. And isn't that what the entire system, the GATT and the WTO, were designed to avoid? Which way do we come out on that? Or do we just say, look, they're there, we can't do anything about it? But I mean, there are two.
Yeah, there are, but in my view, if the WTO is stalled and the rules are not being, updated and market access isn't being improved, I guess the real question is, do you leave things there and nothing happens, or you work with like-minded countries and try and update and improve the rules and improve market access? It's not the best solution, but I think it's better than just leaving, rules at the WTO level.
Yeah,
I would add that the WTO has had in it from its inception two very large regional trade agreements, the European Union and NAFTA, and lots of others. That's not where the WTO's problems come from, and frankly, changing the U.S. administration would have a more significant impact than COVID.
Yeah.
Okay. Shall we move on to the next topic, which is indeed the WTO and the difficulties it's now facing? Gary, do you want to take it first?
So where we stand with the WTO, and I'm not kidding, it's not, I discussed this earlier with some of the panelists. So the problems the U.S. has raised in WTO appellate body are not real problems. That's not what the U.S. is complaining about, and Ambassador Lighthizer has been very candid about it, is he doesn't like binding dispute resolution that affects the U.S. He likes WTO as a negotiating forum because in his theory, the U.S. has enough clout to get what it wants, but he doesn't like binding dispute resolution. All the U.S. complaints are total rubbish. That the appellate body exceeds the 90-day rule. Well, because the 90-day rule was never realistic. And if you think that Boeing Airbus was going to be resolved in 90 days, you're kidding. And the U.S. is busy retaliating based on something that broke the 90-day rule numerous times. The whole thing, none of these complaints are real. They're just ginned up. The U.S. doesn't complain, notably, when the appellate body does the exact same thing in favor of the U.S.
Of course.
The worst example ever is in Canadian softwood lumber. I thought, Spencer, you and Patrick would like that. The appellate body deleted 3 words "in the country" from the text, crucially, and that's a big, big change, and it was in the text for a reason. It was negotiated and paid for. I don't know if Canada would have signed, Mexico wouldn't have. So the U.S. doesn't criticize that decision as exceeding its powers. This is all, they don't like binding dispute resolution. As I mentioned, in USMCA, USTR tried to get away with no binding dispute resolution and got their head handed to them, first by Canada through Congress on Chapter 19, and then by Congress itself on dispute settlement, state to state. So if the U.S. wants, so what the U.S. now finds itself is they're in WTO for negotiating purposes. You wouldn't want to get rid of them. They're a useful market. And they're out of WTO for binding dispute purposes. That's great if you represent the steel industry, as Bob did for 35 years, and as Wilbur Ross may still do. But if you're an exporter, a US exporter, that's a really bad idea. We cannot complain if India starts granting patents for COVID medicines, granting compulsory licensing, or even simply not enforcing its patent rules. Let's say India does not enforce its patent rules. And India has a large, sophisticated pharmaceutical industry, which can make these drugs. So the Indians just turn a blind eye because they need the medicines. What's USTR going to do? They can't go to WTO, slap huge tariffs on India. At some point, that doesn't work. And then China will start making them. They already have tariffs on everything from China. So, I don't, at some point it doesn't work. And this will all depend, obviously, on the election in November. Democrats are normally self-professedly the more protectionist party. That didn't show up in USMCA. They will want protection of labor rights, which they got. But in my view, they looked over the abyss of real protectionism, as in Donald Trump, et cetera, and said, oops, that's not what we want for our constituents who would have been laid off if NAFTA had been killed. So I don't know what a new Democratic administration would do, but I doubt it's going to be as anti-cooperation as the Trump administration. So, but right now, right now, the U.S. is sort of a member of WTO when it feels like it for negotiating purposes. It's not in WTO for purposes of maintaining bound tariffs because it raises tariffs whenever it feels like it. And it's not a member of WTO for binding dispute resolution. So
one of the things which I think is very revealing is that, as you know, many countries, other members of the WTO, come up with possible solutions. And we can talk about the arbitration approach, but the US is not engaging in discussions. They're not saying this is what we want.
Nope.
They're just saying it's wrong, which to me does suggest that they're not. Whereas my view, and I'm based on no evidence, is that the Biden administration would probably negotiate and say, all right, well, there are some things. Because I mean, the concerns with the appellate body go back to the Obama administration. They weren't.
Well, some of the ones from the Obama administration was being a bad loser, which didn't change with Trump.
Right.
And because they didn't mind when they won, then the appellate body was fine. This Canadian softwood lumber case was under Bush. So the U.S., this is not unusual for the U.S. They simply didn't break the system before. There are changes that should be made in the dispute settlement rules. Everyone knows that. When it was put in effect in 1995, it was a first shot. There's a lot of dumb things that should be changed. You have to request a panel twice. That loses at least 30 days. There's no reason on earth for that, et cetera, et cetera. Right. Mexico put forward a very sophisticated diagnosis of the real problems in 1999. And those are still out there to be fixed. And they require serious negotiation. There's a lot of sclerotic movement sometimes in WTO, but the issues the U.S. has been raising are not legitimate issues for the most part. Ambassador David Walker of New Zealand did a very careful job and tried to accommodate the U.S.'s stated complaints to the extent possible, and the U.S. wouldn't deal with it. So I go back to Wendy's view of how you would negotiate this. This for sure, I don't see doing it virtually.
Any thoughts on the EU, Canada, China proposal of arbitration?
Well, so now for 16 members, and more will join, 16 members have binding dispute settlement in the WTO. The others don't. It's Canada, it's some big ones. Japan did not sign on.
Or India.
Or India. India is not that big a participant. Neither is Japan, come to think of it.
No, Argentina didn't, and they were quite active.
Yeah, but Brazil did. And so the big users of the system, minus the US, signed on. And
Mhm.
there's no reason why what was developed won't work. So more and more people will join when they realize they want to protect their exports in the world's largest market, the EU, the world's third largest market, Japan, not Japan, but anyhow, when you add it all up, it's a big chunk of the world economy. And I think eventually, as time goes on, each country discovers they need binding dispute settlement when they run into a dispute on their exports.
Also on the WTO after Doha, any possibility of a multilateral agreement in the foreseeable future, or will we just be dealing with plurilaterals?
Well, that really is the key point, is the problem with dispute resolution becomes much smaller if you have, in effect, a legislative body, which is the negotiating process. If you think the decision was wrong, go get it changed. There's no question. There's no constitution of the WTO, in effect. It's all legislation. The Congress, in effect, the members can change it. If the appellate body mistakenly rules on something, that can be changed by negotiation. You want to make sure all the negotiations, including those, only liberalize. You don't want negotiations where you say we'll raise tariffs together. But with that one rule, it could work. The problem has been they haven't been able to get that done since really, I would say, the amendment on access to medicines. Or the Kimberley process, take your picks. Those are early 2000s. But the US didn't kill Doha, India did. And India may be killing RCEP. So eventually, so in June 2008, there was a meeting of 7 countries convened by LME, US, EU, China, India, Brazil, Japan, Australia, and all 6 agreed, at least for that moment, except India. And at that point, since it wasn't a legally binding document, they shouldn't have been bound by consensus. They weren't. The 6 of them should have walked out and said, we have a deal. The Indian minister would have broken both legs climbing up on the platform. So what they've been working towards is plurilateral deals, and that leave out people who don't agree, and that may be second best, but I think it'll work. So they have to finish some of the plurilateral deals. Services, digital,
environmental goods.
Nah, it's not really environmental. I mean, if bicycles are environmental goods, and then so's everything.
Or Priuses. It all depends what you make.
Exactly. If you wanted a real environmental goods negotiation, you would lower the tariffs based on the amount of GHG emissions on a life cycle basis. And there's nothing, it doesn't look like that.
Forget about plurilaterals, is that in fact the countries that don't sign up get the benefit through the MFN in most cases, not in government procurement, but normally. So, I mean, in fact, the benefit, you get free riders.
Well, but that's, as I said, ITA has free riders, and it turns out the big countries all signed, and the ones that didn't, like India, then did because, their industry wanted it, because the stuff goes back and forth. The people who get hurt by high tariff, I mean, Brazil proved this negatively in the 1990s. If you put high tariffs on semiconductors, you don't make your own electronic stuff.
Exactly. Wendy, anything on WTO that you want to add?
Yeah, just a few thoughts, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on dispute settlement, but I do think the United States has valid concerns with respect to the appellate body. The appellate body has not operated in the way that people envisioned when the Uruguay round was completed and the WTO came into effect. My understanding was supposed to be used more as the exception. Now, many cases are appealed almost on a routine basis. And second, some of these appellate body judges have felt very comfortable in kind of making up their own rules and not really reading the words that the contracting parties agreed to. And so, I think there are legitimate concerns. where I disagree with the administration, as someone who represented the United States in many international and bilateral trade negotiations for many years, it's not enough to just go to the table and say it's not working. I mean, it was always incumbent on parties then, okay, well, tell us how you want it, how you want to improve it, how do you want to fix it, how do you want to update it? And I think the United States, by not putting a proposal on the table, has really kind of weakened its hand. I think of the controversial issue, for example, in the WTO of self-declaration for developing countries in the WTO. The United States doesn't like the current situation where over half of the WTO members are claiming they're developing countries, including China. And so what did they do? They didn't just complain, they put forward a proposal. Now, many people viewed that proposal as kind of over the top, but that's not the point. They put a proposal on the table with words, meaning it's a basis for negotiation. And that's where, I find it really difficult to understand the administration's position, unless, as Gary said, all they want to do is just basically, dismember the appellate body. With respect to negotiations going forward, there is one important multilateral negotiation involving all WTO members ongoing now, and that's the one on fish subsidies. That agreement, let's just say people had hoped that would have been concluded had the June ministerial in Kazakhstan been concluded. And so I think that's going to be a real test as to whether the WTO can really step up to the plate and negotiate agreements. But regardless what happens to fish subsidies, I think plurilaterals are the way to go. I think that groups of countries that want to improve rules should be able to do it. If they can do it under the WTO jurisdiction, I think that's preferable. But I think we're at the juncture where we really need to rethink whether MFN should be a guiding principle for plurilateral negotiations. I personally think those days are over.
Mm-hmm.
A follow-up question. A lot of governments, including the US, are providing assistance to industries negatively impacted by the virus. Gary, Wendy, do either of you have any thoughts on whether we are going to see countervail duty actions against some of this assistance, or, as some people suspect, will there perhaps be some sort of implicit understanding that if you don't go after mine, I won't go after yours? Any thoughts on that?
Well, we did this in 2008 all over the world. The only countervailing duty I'm aware of that went after it was China,
Right.
countervailing US automobiles, the bailout. It also countervailed Buy America and grain subsidies. So I don't think that was so much aimed at the recession subsidies as whatever the US was doing, because the US always complains about Chinese subsidies.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at and the US, Japan, and Europe put out a very, shall I say, innovative proposal in January urging much more control on subsidies. Japan just might be able to comply with what they proposed. There's no chance in hell the US or Europe could have complied even in January, much less now. As a purely technical matter, most of what the US is doing is not specific in WTO terms. Having said that, under the arguments the US successfully made to the appellate body they claim to hate, most of it would be found specific under the positions the US has urged. But the US has some history of this. Wound up owning AIG, Citibank, and General Motors, and it didn't faze them about SOEs. If you look at actually negotiated agreements, the only one that's relevant in terms of moving the ball forward on this is the SOE language in CPTPP, where the US finally had to sign some. For those of you deep into this, there was a US proposal on subsidies in the Doha round that it then had to back for that. It was a think piece. When it put forward an actual written text, it was eviscerated because you've all been in these meetings, at least Wendy, too many of them, where every agency said, wait, We can't go after those. That's what we do. Fannie Mae being the obvious example. So the TPP, and it's really unchanged in CPTPP text, excludes, for example, all, underline, all subcentral subsidies. All. That's China, right? But it's also the US. There are 1,000 municipally owned electric companies in the US. Are they a subsidy? Et cetera, et cetera. So the US can't possibly live up to this, et cetera. My guess is, based on past experience, everyone sort of waved off the 2008, 2009 subsidies. And with luck, they'd do the same. If they don't, they'll be held to pay. Which is the one company singled out more or less by name for subsidies in the US? Boeing.
Boeing.
And not only because of the downturn.
No.
Because of the CMAX.
Yep.
Yeah. So,
Yep.
With luck, no one will start that because everyone's vulnerable.
Right.
Exactly.
If I
Wendy,
can-
anything to add?
No, yeah, so
Oh, sorry.
with respect to China, and Gary had mentioned the trilateral initiative between the United States, Europe, and Japan, where they've come up with kind of draft new rules on prohibited subsidies and how to treat other subsidies. They're working on technology transfer, cyber issues, and other areas. I think that what's going on now as part of these COVID emergency economic packages, I think it's going to muddy the waters a bit with respect to subsidies negotiations going forward, either in the WTO or even bilaterally with China. I mean, it's hard to tell another country, to put rules in place on, disciplining their industrial subsidies when your hands aren't clean. What I hope is that this, quote unquote, the types of assistance we are giving and will give through our stimulus packages will be temporary, won't be specific, et cetera, et cetera. So our hands will be clean. But my experience in negotiating trade agreements, it's much more difficult when you have defensive concerns on your mind. It's very hard to kind of navigate the language that gets at the practices you don't like in the other country without implicating yourself. And even before COVID, this was very difficult to do, as Gary was mentioning, not only with respect to subsidies, but state-owned enterprises and other issues. But I think the COVID stimulus packages and the types of assistance provided to companies, may complicate the efforts with China.
Okay. Well,
the U.S. has the advantage of being blithely unaware of how many subsidies it gives because there's no reporting. But
right.
there's a website called Good Jobs First, which opposes subsidies as corporate welfare, which has the best collection on the U.S. and it's dazzling. But just my hometown of Arlington gave Amazon 1.5 billion, more or less. Chicken feed, the highest bid was 8 to 9 billion. And I note Amazon didn't take it.
Didn't take it, yeah.
Because it had to go where the talent pool was.
Right. Okay, well, Gary and Wendy, we've just started discussing China, and obviously no discussion of the current state of the world trading system could be held without discussing China's role in that. Wendy, start with you on this. US-China trade has been highly contentious for many years. Curious in your thoughts and reactions to where are we now with the US-China Phase 1 deal? We have the US presidential election coming up. What are your thoughts on where the US-China trade tension lies now and where it's going?
Well, in some kind of crazy way, I think trade relations between the US and China is probably in better shape than many of the other issues that our bilateral relationship faces. As a result of the Phase 1 trade deal, which went into effect just about 2.5 months ago, there has been a drop in tension between the two sides on trade. Both sides are in close communication. China is doing its best, in my view, to to implement most of its obligations under the agreement. If I can just put aside the purchasing commitments for 1 minute and focus on the rules with respect to intellectual property protection, technology transfer, financial services, agriculture, non-tariff measures. China's record has been pretty good in implementing those provisions so far. It hasn't been perfect. They were late with their intellectual property plan. It's not clear that all the financial services regulations that they promised to put in effect by April 1 are actually on the books, and some other issues as well. But for the most part, and particularly given the COVID situation, I think it's remarkable that China has, moved as far as it has with respect to taking its commitments seriously. However, on the purchasing side, and just to remind the viewers, under this agreement, China has agreed for 2 years to purchase enormous amounts of U.S. goods, services, and energy, goods meaning agriculture and manufacturing, at unprecedented levels. And in my view, those targets were so difficult to achieve even before COVID. But in the COVID world, where the supply and demand lags are just beginning to be understood, it's going to be impossible, in my view, for those numbers to be achieved. And then the question will be, particularly in the lead up to the presidential election, where China may become an issue, and specifically who's tougher on China, the Democratic or the Republican candidate. There may be pressure on the administration to take some kind of enforcement action against China. I mean, up until now, I think both sides, meaning the US and China, have a shared interest in trying their hardest to show the world that this bilateral trade agreement is working for the United States. This is a big foreign policy achievement for the president, and therefore it's in his interest if he can show that it's working and there aren't problems. And for Xi Jinping, I think it's an important area where he can show that he's managing the US relationship, and that, there are, while there are a lot of tariffs still in place, there are not more tariffs, kind of a pause in that tension. So I think there is a shared interest, but I think the question is, as we get closer to the election, will there be pressure on the administration to show how tough they are on China, not just in the areas of technology or blaming them for the origin of COVID, but under the trade agreement?
If I could just add,
wrapping up, but Gary, anything to add on the China issue?
on the phase 1 agreement, I defer to Wendy totally. She's the expert. On the ag side of it, which is the politically most important in the US, the phase 1 agreement is just basically pretty much everything US agriculture wanted. The changes in regulations on beef, on pork, on poultry are literally all the stuff we've needed for years. And some of it would have happened, a few of them would have happened under Obama, but this is the whole package. And China's been complying. The US has been complying. The US just reduced barriers to Chinese citrus exports, and Florida's going crazy.
Right.
So it'll be interesting to see how it'll be interesting if the US complies as well as China. The commitments, the level of commitments, China has an extremely high personal individual savings rate, and COVID isn't going to lower that, it'll raise it. And so that could be an issue. But Wendy's right, the one way or another, the trade, there's a process now for trade complaints, and with luck, that'll go forward. Politically, both sides have to say they're tough on China, but it's unclear. The U.S. has some commitments also, so it's unclear how this will all work out. But so far, touch wood, I agree with Wendy.
Good.
Well, that's a rather encouraging note to end on, I think. Because unfortunately, I think we are out of time. Any other last thoughts, Wendy? No? Okay. Well, I really want to thank both of you very much indeed for a very enlightening, stimulating conversation. I wish we had more time, but we don't. But perhaps we'll do another one in due course. plenty to discuss. Thank you so much.
Thank you.